Hello and welcome back to my 10 favorite people. Hope you're doing well. I'm incredibly excited for today's video because it's hard to zoom out and look at Bitcoin's price history without acknowledging how bullish this reaccumulation phase below the previous all-time high looks for Bitcoin, especially when you compare it to what we've seen in each and every Bitcoin cycle as Bitcoin approached its previous all-time high. And I truly believe that Bitcoin is gearing up to finally leave the fair value range we have been in since February, and it's hard to believe that we first created this chart in early May of this year, and we said that it was likely Bitcoin would shake a lot of people out with an extended reaccumulation phase once that parabola going back to November of 2022 was broken. And now that we have seen that reaccumulation structure, we even slightly dipped into the cheap region and it got bought up quite aggressively. And we've seen sellers step in every time we entered the expensive region above 70K. And I know the term expensive for Bitcoin triggers a lot of people because if you're expecting Bitcoin to go to 500,000, nothing is expensive as long as we're trading below 100K. But this is just a chart that represents what I believe are good price regions to accumulate Bitcoin based on the opportunities we had in the bear market and in previous cycles. So I don't think buying above 70K, if it's a 5 to 10 year hold, is a terrible idea. I just don't think you're getting an incredible value buying Bitcoin at these prices compared to buying in the low 50,000s or high 40,000s. And if we were to see Bitcoin enter price discovery, I'd be a lot more interested putting my cash into smaller, riskier projects and taking advantage of that mania phase as opposed to buying Bitcoin at those prices. But in this lower cheap region, I'm interested in buying Bitcoin and other large caps in anticipation to then be able to sell them higher once that mania phase does eventually come. And that's why my portfolio is set up the way it is. Some cash on the sidelines to take advantage of huge drops or to buy smaller projects in price discovery, but plenty of spot holdings to take advantage of a huge rally that could start over the next few weeks. And speaking of scenarios, based on the comments on the last video, I decided to add this green scenario here, which is essentially the green true mania phase that everybody is praying for and hoping for, where sometime in the next few weeks, Bitcoin just breaks out and enters pure price discovery and doesn't look back like we've seen for Bitcoin in the 2017 and 2021 cycles. So even though I don't think it's the most likely outcome, I think it's valuable keeping it here. And based on whether or not we see the Fed start doing QE, I think that's what's going to decide between the white and green scenarios I have laid out here. But the reason why I've focused on this yellow scenario more is I do think that it would require a big drop in assets for the Fed to then restart QE instead of them doing it while the risk assets are in price discovery. But it's still a possibility, so I added it here, and I decided to rename the scenario for the broken cycle because I think what would be required for that to occur is a very bad recession, and I don't see any signs that that's imminently happening quite yet. And we knew that Q4 was going to be incredibly volatile. We've already seen that so far. We know that November is going to decide whether this is going to go into price discovery or if we're going to have that one last shakeout. And we've definitely seen the narratives flip back and forth quite aggressively. Within 24 hours, we went from everybody being euphoric that Microsoft was going to have a look and do a shareholder vote on investing in Bitcoin. And then within the same 24 hours, we saw a rumor being spread by the Wall Street Journal that Tether is being investigated by the US Treasury, and that turned out to not really be true. And this is exactly what you expect in these very volatile periods for Bitcoin. You expect everybody to be euphoric and for the narrative to be incredibly positive whenever price starts going up, and then something comes out of nowhere and surprises the market, causes Bitcoin to correct, shakes out a lot of leverage, and resets the price. And this is being further exaggerated by the election just 9 days away, and I expect a lot of surprises over the next 9 days as both sides make a push for the finish line. But if we ignore narratives and seasonality and just look at Bitcoin's price structure, we had lower highs and lower lows for months And now we've been seeing higher lows and higher highs, and we have Bitcoin officially breaking above its trend line. And I know there's a lot of arguments on how this should be drawn. Should it be drawn like this? Should it be drawn like this? Should it be drawn like this? The reason I draw it the way I do is because I draw it based on our first two highs before we knew what all of these candles were going to do after the fact. Because if you go based on those first two highs, you can avoid the bias of always having to readjust every time Bitcoin had a lower high. And that's why I have this trend line the way I have it set up. And what we clearly see is a clean break above the trend line and a clean weekly close at a new higher high. And as of right now, this looks like a clean bullish retest of our trend line that we've been below since March of this year. So no warning signs quite yet. And based purely on price structure, I have to assume Bitcoin is going to rally higher in the short term. And this brings us to global liquidity, which is still slowly working its way down thanks to the strength we've seen in the US dollar, which is once again facing resistance. And the US dollar index going up and liquidity going down doesn't mean Bitcoin's price can't increase. It just makes it very unlikely that we're going to see a huge mania phase like 2021 or 2017 while global liquidity is going down. And if anything, it's probably just a slow grind higher or some sideways consolidation until we see a reversal in global liquidity. And I don't expect global liquidity to start going higher until we see the US dollar index roll over. And I saw a comment point out that this is similar to what we saw in 2016 when the US dollar index rallied until the end of the year, and Bitcoin was still able to slowly go sideways and higher while the US dollar index was rallying higher. But then once the US dollar index rolled over, that's when Bitcoin rallied incredibly aggressively. And this is quite different from what we saw in 2020. The US dollar index dropped from about March because of how much stimulus the Federal Reserve was doing. So maybe we see the US dollar index slightly grind higher. Maybe that means Bitcoin goes sideways or slightly goes higher as well. But then once we get that aggressive rollover in the US dollar index, that's when we can see Bitcoin and crypto as a whole really go risk on. And that's when we see the incredible alt season that everybody has been waiting for and praying for. And this makes sense because usually the bull run is started by Bitcoin entering price discovery, and it's likely that we're not going to see alt season until Bitcoin actually breaks above 80,000, which is why my portfolio is relatively conservative when it comes to altcoins, and I'm waiting for Bitcoin to enter price discovery before really going risk on. So I think that aligns nicely with perhaps Bitcoin slowly grinding higher while the US dollar index is slowly going higher. And then we really get the party started once the US dollar index rolls over. And the requirement for that is the Fed announcing that they're going to go back to quantitative easing and increasing the size of their balance sheet, which is not what we've seen quite yet. And this is incredibly important because we know what happens when the Federal Reserve cuts rates to front run recession without switching to QE. That's why we saw the huge crashes in 2001 and 2008. So even though we have the market pricing in a lot of rate cuts, we really have to watch out for the FOMC meeting on November 7th to see what Powell is going to say for their QE plans and whether or not we're going to see them start QE in November or December of this year. As for traditional markets and the S&P 500, red week this week, still well above those major swing highs that we want to see us maintain above. It's also dragging Bitcoin down a little bit based on the price action we saw on Thursday and Friday. But as long as the S&P 500 is in price discovery, Bitcoin has a solid backdrop to grind higher. And we saw some positive news this week, like the Pennsylvania House of Representatives passing a pro-crypto bill. We're also continuing to see incredibly large Bitcoin ETF inflows, and sometimes this has resulted in some short-term local highs. But when we think about medium to long-term trends, these large spot ETF inflows are incredibly bullish for Bitcoin, in my opinion, as they take up more and more supply from the market and make it way more accessible for investors to allocate to Bitcoin without having to self-custody if they don't want to. So for now, all we have to do is be patient. Our first warning sign would be Bitcoin closing below 62,000. It is quite far away from that price level right now, so nothing really to worry about, and I'm only going to be sitting on my hands until we enter price discovery or lose 62K on a weekly closing basis. And I still believe it is unlikely we see Bitcoin go back to the low 40,000s. Now, unlikely doesn't mean that it's impossible. So if you're in a leverage long here, that's going to get liquidated if Bitcoin goes below 50K. I wouldn't be incredibly comfortable in that position if I were you, but if it's mostly spot holdings and if there were some black swan surprise, you wouldn't be shaken out by a huge correction, then I think we don't have anything to worry about. As for the economic data, we always watch this because it's so crucial for the Fed's rate cut decisions and whether or not they can go back to QE. Our leading indicator for inflation, trueflation, still looks fine and is still well below 3%, which is where we want to see it stay. And we'll continue to monitor CPI and core CPI prints to see how that progresses. As for the labor market, another low initial jobless claims reading this week as well, which means we're not seeing layoffs going up. We're also not seeing a huge increase in the number of unemployed people, which likely means we're not going to see a huge spike in the unemployment rate quite yet, which means that for now, at least in the short to medium term, we don't really have any imminent recession concerns that could crash risk assets. And finally, as we look forward at the medium to long term and the national deficits being run by the federal government, and the fact that we're only seeing these deficits increase, especially because they're having to generate this debt at higher interest rates, this is what they're using to keep real GDP positive, and it's very hard to have a recession on paper when the federal government is spending trillions of dollars, and that means the trend of the US government debt increasing is only going to continue, and eventually it's going to get monetized and pull the M2 money supply up with it, which is why I expect risk assets to go a lot higher in the medium to long term, just like they have historically. Will there be surprises? Will there be shakeouts? Will there be corrections? Of course, but when we look at Bitcoin's price history and look at the price action we've seen each and every time in these reaccumulation phases, and the fact that we're embarking on a Fed cutting cycle, and perhaps we're going to see the Fed go back to doing QE over the next few months, it's very hard for me to not remain bullish and to consider selling my Bitcoin while we've seen this very healthy consolidation and while we have this incredible liquidity backdrop. Once we see global liquidity reverse and work its way higher, which is inevitable because of the debt being issued by these central banks. But as always, let me know what you expect. Are you concerned here? Are you bearish? Are you bullish, expecting higher prices? It's going to be a crazy few days as we approach this election, and I expect Bitcoin's price action to be incredibly volatile as we get closer to it. So for now, we have to remain patient, see what happens, monitor the data. And as always, thank you so much for the support on the recent videos. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll talk to you soon.